In current days, access to video games has never been easier. You can pull up games on your smartphone, on your laptop, or on any of the consoles made by Nintendo, Xbox, Sony, PlayStation, etc. And easy access to video games has been commonplace for 30 years or more. But there was a time way back in the day when that wasn't the case. For the majority of kids of the 1970s and 80s, if you wanted to play video games, you had to go to a separate building, get a whole bunch of quarters, wait in line behind your favorite machine, and pay the price. So let's look back at the golden age of the video arcade right now. Video arcades and the video arcade games themselves go back about 50 years to the creation of the first stand-up arcade game known as Computer Space in 1971. It was created by Ted Dabney and Nolan Bushnell. Bushnell would go on to create Atari later on in the same decade. That game was kind of a failure, even though it was in the movie Soylent Green, which was supposed to be in the future. And then in 1972 came Pong, which was the legendary table tennis game. When you look back at it now, it doesn't look legendary, but at the time, the idea of being able to play a game like that was unbelievable. Nolan Bushnell created the Atari VCS video computer system in 1977, and this was a way to get a lot of games that would go on to become arcade favorites at home for people. But getting the Atari was not the same as today with access to games. So if you wanted to play them, there was a place called a video arcade. Now, video arcades are still around today. Standalone ones don't exist as much as they used to. You'll typically find an arcade as a part of a bowling alley. Sometimes restaurants. I know in Hyannis on Cape Cod, there's a place called Flashback, and it's an arcade, bar, restaurant. But back in the late 70s, early 80s, video arcades were standalone. I guess you could call them gaming centers too, because it wasn't all just computer games. You'd have the skee ball or the basketball hoops, but these upright games that were 6 feet or so tall, like big cabinets with screens, were all lined up on the walls, sometimes clustered in the middle of the arcade room itself. And you walk into the video arcade and it's just a wall of different sounds and sound effects and the dropping of quarters. There was a time in the 80s where this was the place to be. You either go to the video arcade or you go to the mall. That golden age of video arcades, late 70s through the early to mid 80s, included games like Space Invaders and Pac-Man. This was when video arcades were as common as convenience stores. In 1982, there were 24,000 standalone arcades, 400,000 smaller street arcades, they're called, and more than 1.5 million video arcade game consoles sold in America. These arcade consoles cost as much as $3,000 each in 1982. Or just over $9,200 when adjusted for inflation. I remember being amazed when my friend Matt had RBI baseball in an actual cabinet video game in his bedroom. I have no idea how much his parents paid for that, but he and I definitely played it a lot when I was over there. The popularity and the money earned by video arcades kept going up in the early 80s. In 1981, the video arcade industry grossed more than $5 billion. My experience in arcades came after the video game crash of 1983, which almost ended the industry, but Nintendo saved it with Super Mario Brothers. In arcades, though, like I said, it wasn't only the stand-up cabinet games. There was, in the gaming centers, you'd have the basketball, the skee ball, regular pinball machines, the air hockey tables, maybe one of those punching bags that could demonstrate your strength. I just remember going in there with a few dollars, going to the change machine where you have to slide your dollar in and it would shoot out the 4 quarters. I enjoyed the fighting games like Street Fighter or the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle fighter. Then there were the really popular ones, like the driving games that the cabinet itself for the game was shaped like a car and you got into it. So you were totally immersed in this game. The problem was that the arcade owners knew how much kids liked it, so it would cost more. And that was the big issue for me, was if you're playing a game and you get to a certain level, but then you die, putting in a second quarter was like hitting the save on a console now. And you'd get only so far, and then you'd run out of quarters and just be so mad, slam your hand on the console, hit the side of the cabinet, and hope that nobody that worked there heard you. Some of these video arcades had little snack bar areas to fleece teenagers out of more money. Growing up, though, I remember there being video consoles inside convenience stores, sub shops, pizza places. Because why not, if you're paying for lunch while you're waiting for it, pay to play video games too? There was a place down the street from me, Harry's Sub Shop. They had a Tetris machine in there, and I had the high score on that for a long time. But the problem was Harry's closed down and Tetris was gone. I was like George Costanza on Seinfeld with Frogger, wanting to save the machine with his high score. But as time went on, there was a shift where consoles at home, Nintendo, Sega, it was easier to just buy the machine and buy the game rather than going to an arcade. By the late 80s, the golden age of the video arcade was already over. They still had the classics. Like I said, Street Fighter I loved. Mortal Kombat, there was always a line to play the bloodiest game ever at the time. Now, like I said, they're usually video arcades that are attached to something else, part of a larger entertainment complex. And some of them might have newer games, but a lot of them have the classics like Donkey Kong, Q*bert, Pac-Man, Pole Position, Galaxia, Galaga, Asteroids. What other ones? What am I forgetting out there? I mentioned Frogger, Burger Time, Dig Dug, Centipede, Spy Hunter. There's so many. I could just name them all off, and eventually I'll hit one that you remember playing at the arcade. The king of arcade games was Space Invaders, that sold more than 750,000 of those cabinet games. I was actually shocked that it was almost double Pac-Man, which was at 400,000. But like I said, by the early 90s, the arcade sensation was kind of over. I think Street Fighter 2 was like the last arcade hit. After that, most of the games that you would play in arcades ended up being released on home consoles as well. Granted, you couldn't play 10 different arcade games in one sitting, but you could get a favorite game and play the hell out of it. I definitely didn't live at the arcade like a lot of kids I knew did, but I had plenty of time in the 80s riding to the arcade on my bike or getting a ride and getting dropped off while the family did something else, saving up quarters as best I could and figuring out how many games I could play. Those single quarter games were the best, but like I said, as it got on and the games were 2 or 3 quarters just to play once, it's like, oh man, it's really cutting into your playing time. But those of you listening that used to go to the arcade a lot, late 70s through the early 90s, what were your favorite games? What was the weirdest place that you saw that had a video arcade game? Like I said, convenience stores, some quick restaurants. It's definitely another one of those things that has from a bygone era, where kids these days that just have games on their phones or all these different consoles, the idea of leaving the house and going to a separate building to play those games is a foreign concept. But back in the day, back in the mid-'80s, late 80s, getting on your bike and going to an arcade was a huge bonus. And God help you if you had a video arcade inside the mall, then it was a double whammy. Go and play all the games and blow all your money and then sit and hang out like a mall rat for the rest of the night. Who'd have ever thought I'd be wistfully looking back at that bygone era? But here we are.